Hello, and welcome to another engaging episode of Stan the History Man. And I'm your host, Dr. Stanley Sandler. And today I'm going to be talking about something that's very topical, of course, with what's going on in the Middle East and so on. I want to talk about the British mandate over Palestine. And it's something that's very rarely spoken of. I mean, only historians and scholars and so on really know much about it. So I'll take you through it. The whole story begins when the Turks make a very bad move. They jump the wrong way in World War I, 1914, and they side with the Germans. Now, Britain had kind of traditionally been a friend of Turkey against Russia, especially in the sort of great game in Afghanistan. But the Turks, anyway, they went against the British and the Allies. I don't think we ever declared war. The United States ever declared war on Turkey, but that's another story. And so the British fought in Turkey. They had the landing at the Gallipoli Peninsula, which they thought would give them a way into Constantinople, and then Istanbul was called by then, and then a sort of back door to Berlin. Well, it was a kind of a cockamamie scheme, and I must admit it was dreamed up by Winston Churchill, and it took him a long time to live it down. But the Turks were tough fighters, and they were armed by the Germans with heavy artillery, and they blasted the British naval land. In fact, the Gallipoli now is apparently the biggest battleship graveyard in the world. They got all the battles. I think 4 or 5 battleships were sunk there by Turkish mines or by German heavy artillery manned by the Turks. Turks are tough fighters. And so the troops landed, and they had a long, bloody war, intense heat, and the flies were terrible. It's just no place to fight a war. And eventually, the British realized it's not worth it, and they evacuated like one night. And the Turks got up the next morning ready to attack the British, and they were gone. The British say, well, we're pretty good at evacuations, I guess Dunkirk, okay? So they evacuated without the loss of a single life. But then the British also fought the Turks in Mesopotamia and in the Middle East, including Palestine. As a matter of fact, another disaster was up the Tigris River, trying to get at the Turks. And the Turks surrounded them and made them surrender. One of the very few times when the British, they've lost battles, but in this case, is to surrender to the Turks. Anyway, they finally, Turkey did lose the war. One of the actual reasons for it, you probably know about Lawrence of Arabia. He was a British agent, and he rallied the Arabs to fight against the Turks, and it succeeded. So anyway, Turkey after the war had to lose a war in those days. You had to pay for it, and so the payment Turkey had to make was all of its Asian territories: Mesopotamia, Palestine, Libya, Syria. These were all given over to the Allies. Now, we didn't want to touch that sort of the United States, but Britain and France got what the newly formed League of Nations was called a mandate. That is, they couldn't own the property, but they could run it. And it was like the French ran Syria and Lebanon under French law, and the British ran Palestine under British law. And so, what the British occupation of Palestine ended at the end of the war, 1914, 1919, 1920. Then the British actually stationed troops in Palestine to keep the peace, as it were, because already there is unrest between Jews and Arabs. Although I think most of them felt that the British would be an improvement on the Turks because they were rough customers. I remember reading about how that the peasants would have their taxes, their annual taxes, in grain, a pile on the ground, and they'd sit up all night guarding that grain because if they didn't have it, the Turks would take it out on them. So I don't think the British were quite that bad in Palestine, and they kept the old Roman name of Palestine. But already trouble erupted between the Jews and the Arabs, and for example, the 1920 is a serious massacre by the Arabs of the Jews, and so that this went on throughout the British mandate. The mandate eventually wound up with two British divisions in Palestine, and keeping Jew and Arab separate. Now, one of the things is you've heard that they say, "Oh, well, the Jews stole our land." Well, wait, if you're living in a British administered territory, you want to buy somebody's land, you buy it under British law, which would be like you want to buy property from a bloke in Manchester. You go to him, you say, how much do you want for it? And you negotiate back and forth and come to agreement, you register it. So actually what happened were the Jews coming over there were buying land from the Arab landholders. As a matter of fact, the British, I'm sorry, the Jewish agency, which was sort of responsible for Jewish affairs in Palestine, was issuing bonds in which Jews from around the world would buy these bonds, and they used the money from the bonds to buy land. To buy land, not take it. Okay, the British wouldn't allow that. It's bad form, don't you know? So that went on with increasing violence between the Jews and the Arabs, and both of them kind of dumped on the British. And in fact, there were, as well as there were Arab terror squads, there were also Jewish terror squads that would blow up Arab neighborhoods and that type of thing. So it happened on both sides. So I would have to say the Arabs were more active in that sort of thing than the Jews. So the Jews really developed the land between the wars. Tel Aviv was just a mud village, but really until it became a bustling metropolis, basically the center of Jewish life and culture, Tel Aviv. Well, in 1939, the British were the war is coming. They're afraid there's going to be war, and we've got to do something with this Palestine business. And so in 1939, the Peel Commission was committed, a commission, a British commission, which was going to draw Arabs between a Jewish and an Arab state. They would say, "Oh, we're going to have an Arab state now." Well, they had the opportunity for it beginning in 1939. Now the Jews didn't like it. We don't. This is you're cutting off a lot of our ancestral land and that type of thing. But we'll better half a loaf than none. But the Arabs said, no way, we cannot alienate Arab land or Muslim land. As a matter of fact, many of them still yearn for Spain. But Spain was ruled by Muslims for at least 400 years, or longer than that, from about 700 to 1492, when the last Moorish stronghold in Spain was evacuated. And the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran was saying, yes, we want to we yearn for Spain again, Andalusia. Okay. At any rate, the Peel Commission collapsed. It didn't get anywhere. And so then World War II began, and the British began to arm a lot of the Arab countries around there to like Egypt, for example, to defend against the Germans. Of course, and Rommel is rampaging across North Africa, and the very real fear that he would, get into Egypt and then cross the canal and get into Palestine. You can imagine the Nazis in Palestine. I mean, that's pretty bad news. So the area was really very heavily armed. Certainly the Arab armies were very well armed. Well, at the end of the war, the British were bankrupt by the war. They'd fought two world. The British were the only Allied power in World War I and II from the beginning to the end. So it's no wonder that they were really worn out by 1945. They had the two wars, and they went through a period of austerity for 10 years after the war. And they felt that we can't have these two divisions in Palestine eating their heads off for a goal which we don't know. I mean, we don't care what happens there. And so they did what the British do very well. They evacuated, another British evacuation. They had the two divisions lined up. They had the brass bands playing, the bagpipers skirling. And to this day, older Jews and Arabs remember the British put on a good show, and they marched down to the docks at Haifa and got on their troop ships. And on that very same day, the Jewish agency declared the state of Israel. Well, of course, the Arab nations weren't too happy with that. And so all five Arab nations declared war on Israel, and all but Iraq actually invaded Israel. And to the new state of Israel, to everyone's astonishment, the Jews beat them. And of course, the UN came in to make the peace and that type of thing. But to everyone's astonishment, the stereotype was, well, the Jews, they're shopkeepers and that type of thing, and they don't they don't fight that well. Well, they certainly in Israel, or Palestine, if you will, they showed that they did. And so anyway, what I'm talking about, basically, the British Mandate finally came to an end in 1948 with the founding of the Jewish state. Of course, some people say if the British hadn't got into Palestine in the first place, maybe we wouldn't have had all this trouble. And of course, don't forget that the French were in Lebanon and Syria as well. So the whole British Mandate and British laws and everything ended, and with the ending of the British Mandate. A little known story in 1948. Well, thank you for listening, and hope to see you again on Stan the History Man.